correct. I would say if you rewind the clock 7 years ago, what was procurement, right? Procurement was, well, yeah, make sure you get the right stuff to the right place on time, but really save us money, right? Find savings, avoid inflation. And those are your main KPIs, right? On-time delivery and what did you do from a net savings standpoint? And then the pandemic hit, and then suddenly there were shortages everywhere, stuff you didn't even see coming, new things every day. And so now I think companies or executive teams are much more willing to spend the time and the money and the resources on preventing some of that.
Well, welcome back, everyone, to this episode of Smarter Sourcing. My name is John Pavia, and today I have with us Kevin Spinti, Vice President of Global Procurement for Heraeus Medevio. Kevin, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, John.
So before we go any further, I think just so we level set everybody who's listening and watching, if you could, why don't you introduce Heraeus Medevio to our listeners and viewers?
Sure. So Medevio is one of the operating companies within Heraeus, which is a large family-owned company headquartered in Germany. So within our operating company, we are making medical devices and components for medical devices. So lots of things in the catheter space, housings, guide wires, neuromodulation devices, and implantable devices. So both, again, full devices and components for those devices. And we're selling to any of the major medical device OEMs whose names you probably know.
And how long have you been there?
I've been there a little over 6 years, all in this role. Seen a lot of change in that time. We've more than doubled in size, made several acquisitions, expanded our product portfolio, and expanded our capabilities as well.
So I want to get to what the company does today, what you do for the company, but let's talk about how you got there. So a little bit about your history, your unique animal in that you're both Marquette and DePaul.
Yeah. Undergrad was Marquette in Milwaukee. Yep.
And then the MBA at DePaul.
Yes.
So how did that work? Because they're rivals in some sports, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. And I mean, they're in rival cities, right? Milwaukee and Chicago have a bit of a rivalry. But so I grew up in Milwaukee. I had a great internship lined up in Milwaukee already before I started college. So sticking around there made a lot of sense. And I love that Marquette is right there next to downtown Milwaukee. So you have a ton of good opportunities, not only from a social and fun scene, but also from a business internship scene. Hadn't really thought about the rivalry. When I chose DePaul, my wife and I were living in Chicago area at the time, and DePaul offered, for me at least, the right mix of value for the MBA in terms of good quality, but not the most expensive, and also schedule flexibility in that they had some satellite campuses out in the suburbs that are a little easier to get to than the downtown campus when we were living and working out in the suburbs.
And when you were at DePaul, was it in business school that you started thinking about procurement? Was it, or was that the furthest thing from your mind?
No, I actually started in procurement way back when, even in my internship.
Okay.
So I was fortunate enough to work for a great company, Direct Supply in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and their approach, they're a very fast-growing company. Their approach was to hire smart people and then figure out where they fit best. And so I started there, like I said, right before I started at Marquette, and tried a couple different roles and ended up really enjoying and really thriving in the purchasing department there. And so that's when I decided I was going to major in operations and supply chain management at Marquette. Learned a ton about it, really enjoyed it, and really so I've been in procurement or purchasing my whole career since then.
It's so strange. The majority of people that we have on the show, they sort of fell into supply chain or sourcing and procurement. It wasn't something that they were dreaming about when they were in their undergrad or even business school. But then there's a couple that's exactly what happened to them. They got into an internship, or one of their early jobs was in somewhere in the supply chain. And a lot of times they're from the middle of the country. And I think there's something I know there's a logic there, and there's dots to connect. Do you have a theory about why a lot of good procurement people and certain supply chain people come from the middle of the country?
Probably because a lot of stuff goes through there, and you have a lot of different businesses that interact there, right? You got a lot of major corporations, a lot of CPG corporations that are headquartered in some of the big cities there, but then you have a lot of agriculture moving through there, lots of machine shops and everything. If you think about like the Rust Belt area of the Midwest. So I think with all those disparate types of companies, disparate industries, there's something there for everybody, right? Because I've talked to people who work in procurement in the ag side. It is completely different from anything I've done. Also very interesting, but very different from anything on an industrial side or manufacturing side.
Mm.
And so maybe there's enough uniqueness there to draw people in. And if, whether you grew up on a farm, you had to do actually a decent amount of supply chain management and operations growing up on a farm, versus if you grew up in a city, there's some of that too. So I think there's a bit of a draw for everybody.
And before your current position, you spent quite a few years at Eaton Manufacturing, just like you said. So that's probably very different from what you're doing today, even.
Oh yeah, Eaton was manufacturing things on a larger scale sidewise. You're buying much larger parts, less regulation what you deal with in the med device industry, and just a different end customer, right? You're dealing with a lot of mobile OEMs, so ag and construction equipment and everything. So just a totally different value proposition there as well.
So you started talking about, or you touched upon how in your time at Heraeus that you've seen so many things change. And so let's talk about that for a second, because you've been there since 2018, you said, or 2017?
Yep,
Right, so
2018, yeah.
All right, so you're there through the pandemic, and we're recording this on the morning that the longshoremen came to a tentative deal. Well, the unions came to a tentative deal with management. So I'm curious, what have you seen change? What are the things that, and I know you're going to touch on technology and whatnot, but give me the top three things that you think have really changed your job, your industry, your specific role, and the whole supply chain world in general.
And I think the biggest change is probably how we work. And that's not a very interesting answer, because everyone's like, oh, remote work and everything and hybrid work has changed. But that really is the honest truth, where in the past, my entire team was in the office 5 days a week, but also the work then was much more regionally or locally focused. So if you were a buyer in our Minnesota facility, you bought for that facility. Yes, you were talking about people from other facilities, but your entire focus was the facility you sat in that you went to 5 days a week. And then everybody was located at a facility. And then in the pandemic, we had people move for family reasons or other things. We had people start working remotely, not tied to a facility. But also with the rise in work over Zoom or Teams, and just being able to be more connected that way, we shifted and we were able to have people work on a more regional or even global basis, where instead of being the buyer just for one facility you sit at, you're covering maybe one category across multiple facilities and buying regionally. Helps from the communication and coordination standpoint. It really helped when we were having some of the shortages needing prioritized, right? You might have one supplier who supplies 6 different plants, and you say, hey, I really need this order. What can you do, supplier? And the supplier says, well, you have these other 3 orders. I can swap places if you can deprioritize one of these other 3. Well, those other 3 might be for 3 different facilities. And now if you have one buyer responsible for each of those 3, this becomes an awful coordination game, and do this 10 times a week sometimes at the height of the pandemic. Now, instead, if you have one buyer responsible for that supplier, even covering all 4 of those plants, they can know or quickly determine on their own which of these is the priority, or which of these can I deprioritize and push out a couple of weeks to pull in my urgent order.
How many people do you have in your organization?
Right now, I've got 24 globally.
And they cover indirect and direct?
Yep. Everything we buy, indirect, direct, equipment, the whole 9 yards.
And so just in generalizations, how much in hundreds of millions of dollars go through your organization in supply chain, both direct and indirect? Just roundabout.
Yeah, a couple $100 million.
Yeah, it's got to be enormous. And you're spread out, the 24 people split sort of evenly between direct and indirect, or is direct bigger?
Direct is a little bigger, but a lot of them have a foot in both spaces. So a lot of our indirect things are like clean room consumables and gloves and that kind of thing, things you need for production at the same time as the direct materials. So we have a lot of buyers who are buying, you're buying the metals or the molded items or the extrusion, and also buying gloves. So on the operational side, we don't really divide it much. On the strategic side, we have one category manager who's covering all of the indirect items. And then we have 2 category managers covering all the direct items.
And those people are spread out in how many countries?
We have facilities in Singapore, Czech Republic, Germany, Switzerland, US, and Costa Rica. And so every facility has at least one person at it, and some of the bigger facilities have 4 or 5 people in procurement located there.
So when you talked about your first answer was how things changed. You said, how people work today versus they did before. And I'm curious, how easily did you make that transition from having people there in their offices versus now they're working from home and everything's being done by Zoom? Was that an easy transition for you, or harder, or easier than you thought? Because I know for me, I was one of those guys. I said, oh, okay, I could never work at home, never. And then the pandemic hit, and I don't know, don't even have an explanation for it. But other than maybe I needed, my 4 kids all came home, they were all gone, so the house was packed, and I needed to be focused. So I would just shower, get ready for work like I always did, and went to my desk, which was right, 10 feet away, and I was a lot more productive than I ever thought I'd be. But what about you? What was your experience like?
I'd say very similar to your thought and approach and experience. So my kids are smaller, but we're home doing virtual school all day in the office right next to mine. So I became part-time IT support. But I would say it did free me up to be a little more productive in that, especially the first couple of months of the pandemic, it was wake up early in the morning, right? Because we have locations in Singapore, locations in Europe, and figure out, okay, what broke today? And then you just work your way west as people start waking up. So to not have the drive in the morning, to be able to, like you said, roll out of bed, shower, and hop in your office in a matter of minutes, it freed up more time to be on the phone and figure out what broke and how do we fix it. And I know that's not the case for everybody, right? There's a lot of people who couldn't wait to get back in the office, at least part-time. I enjoy the hybrid setup, being able to be more productive at home, especially, again, with a global organization. I end up spending most of my days, whether I'm in the office or not, on Teams calls with colleagues, but then being able to go and physically and see people is nice too. You can't replace that personal interaction as much as you try with video calls and everything.
So what has changed in terms of your contingency planning when you think about the last, 7-8 years in your role, especially having gone through the pandemic, especially, and I'm really curious to hear your answer on, all right, so we got hit with this longshoreman strike. Thankfully, it looks like it's now over and it's pretty quick. But, in speaking with other folks in roles like yours, I think one of the biggest things that has changed, and I also want to talk about their seat at the table, because I think that's a big change compared to what it was 7 years ago. But in the way they plan now for contingencies like a worldwide pandemic or whatever. Here we just had a longshoreman strike where the ports mostly on the East Coast were shut down. And did that factor into your planning in the last couple of weeks? And was it done a little differently than it would have been done 8 years ago?
So I'd say specifically on the longshoreman strike, that didn't impact us much at all. We buy and sell a lot of very small, very high value items. So we're doing a lot of air freight anyway, right? We do a lot of stuff that includes or is made of precious metal, which, you're talking $20, $30, $40 a gram for that. So tying up all that working capital on boats, usually not a great and a sound decision. But yes, in terms of risk mitigation, huge impact. I would say if you rewind the clock 7 years ago, what was procurement, right? Procurement was, make sure you get the right stuff to the right place on time, but really save us money, right? Find savings, avoid inflation. And those are your main KPIs, right? On-time delivery and what did you do from a net savings standpoint? And then the pandemic hit, and then suddenly there were shortages everywhere, stuff you didn't even see coming, new things every day. And so now I think companies or executive teams are much more willing to spend the time and the money and the resources on preventing some of that. And so I still think we as an industry are finding our way in terms of optimal risk evaluation tools. That's still a bit of a nascent industry, and I've never seen a perfect solution. Everything's either too tough to integrate or too expensive or not accurate enough in the prediction or some combination of those. And so everyone kind of pieces it together. But I definitely see that executive teams and plant managers and everything are willing to spend the capital equipment to maybe dual source something or in-source part of something or have dual capability inside. Or even within our own facilities, maybe we only had one facility making something, and we're going to send some of that equipment to another facility, and now we have 2 facilities making the same thing, just for an internal protection if there were some geopolitical event or natural disaster. So that's probably the biggest change. I spend more of my time now on risk evaluation and mitigation than I did pre-COVID. and more of it's an attempt at looking at how do we understand risks on a short-term basis, but also on a medium and long-term basis. And I feel like pre-COVID, it was maybe more of a long-term, what's a financial risk here from a bankruptcy standpoint? What do we see long-term versus, there might be a military conflict. You have people like Israel and Gaza or Ukraine or whatever. There might be a military conflict that impacts your supply chain tomorrow. Maybe that was less prevalent before.
Yeah. And so your seat at the table, what have you noticed and what has changed when it comes to, and you were the supply chain guy and you're still the supply chain guy, but almost universally the folks that I've spoken with in similar roles, their seat at the table has changed quite a bit from what it was pre-pandemic to today.
Yep. So definitely an elevated presence. I would say, similar to what I said before, the questions I get asked more is not just, hey, how are you on delivery? How are you on savings? Usually it's, okay, we talk about the saving number. Now let's dig into what are the big risks you see and what do we as a corporation need to do about it? So there's a lot more questions on that side, a lot deeper questions. People willing to put in the budget money for better tools to understand the risk, money for capital equipment, and for people resources to execute projects that will reduce risk, whether it's dual sourcing projects or even just qualifying a second site at a supplier to help reduce the risk within the same supplier, anything like that. So there's a lot more attention paid there. Usually it was like you get the question from the finance guy, hey, what does savings look like? What's inflation look like? Now you get questions from multiple different functions, and usually it's a lot more around either risks they've seen or risk mitigation or wanting an update in that area.
Yep. So based on everything you've said so far, now in 2024, what keeps you up at night from a perspective of you really need to make sure your team would be ready for what you fill in the blank?
I don't know that I can pick one specific material or one specific industry, but I think it would generally be anything that's going to provide a huge disruption. I know that's probably not a great specific answer, but we buy across so many different suppliers and countries and industries that a disruption in anything, whether it be air freight or ocean freight or in the metals industry or in the plastics industry, anything is going to ripple across to influence us. I mean, ultimately, we do buy a lot of different plastics and a lot of different metals. So anything in either of those industries would be hugely impactful. But I say it's been very different because we've had a pickup in aerospace will threaten our titanium supply. And while that's a very small thing of what we do, it's still really important for those couple product lines.
Yeah. Most of your things move by air versus water. I could even see, and I guess that's what I'm talking about. How do you handle, all of a sudden there's, a hurricane on the East Coast and, airports are shut down or anywhere in the world. And all of a sudden, do you have to start now making contingency plans to reroute things and whatnot?
I mean, I would say from that standpoint, do you remember several years ago when there was the volcano that erupted, I think in Iceland, and there was all flights were shut down in the Europe area for
I got stuck in Europe for a couple of days.
Yeah. So that, given where our a handful of our suppliers are located, where our sites are located, that would be a huge disruption. Not that we wouldn't necessarily have the safety stock to get through it if it were a week, but if it were something more serious or more localized, near one of our suppliers or plants, that would probably shut down production for some time. And so that would be a big one. I think one of the extended impacts I think about that from a downstream standpoint is we're supplying components and medical devices into the medical industry, right? So people are depending on things we make or components of things we make to help improve their lives, right? That's our main mission, is to improve 100 million lives annually. So delays in those shipments, delays in those products can negatively impact someone's life, can negatively impact their treatment. And so just from a bigger picture view, it's not like, oh, okay, we're shut down for a week, we're going to miss this amount of revenue, we're going to have this customer that's unhappy. Like, no, there's a patient potentially sitting in a hospital who needs this device or this treatment, and they're going to really struggle or could even potentially die without it.
With a team of 24 spread out over the world, how do you maintain continuous improvement? How do your training, is that done in a sort of a programmatic, very formal way, or is it more ad hoc at your place?
It's a little bit of both, because we need to tailor it to specific individuals. We do a lot of different group training, right? So we're going to have, last year we had a couple sessions with very focused negotiation training, both virtual and bringing the team together to do some role playing and everything. So, one of the next things we're working on is upping people's project management skills. Again, bringing much of the team together and focusing on those specific details but then also we have people at every different point in their careers, right? I've got people on my team who've been doing procurement for 20 years, and they know exactly how to do supplier selection and put together category strategy and how to negotiate well and everything. They have a very different training need than someone I have who joined the team earlier this year and has no prior experience in procurement, but man, they really get work done. And so then that's just about, okay, understanding the principles of procurement. How do we buy? How do we negotiate? What's an economic order quantity? Really kind of in procurement boot camp, but the whole team doesn't need that. And so then that's a lot of individual one-on-one. Hey, I got this one person on my team who's great with, understanding economic order quantity and how to maintain that within SAP. Put them together for an hour, train the new person. Now they're off and running.
So it sounds like you brought over the philosophy that you experienced early on in your career of taking the best player off the board, even though they may not be the tried and true, they don't fit that perfect profile of a, up and coming procurement person. You just mentioned someone who didn't really have much procurement experience, but is new to your organization. So that's still something that you do in your organization that now that you're the one hiring.
Yeah. Long ago, I had a great manager who said, what are the most important things you're looking for when you hire somebody? And he said, it's the BCDs, brain, character, and drive, right? Nowhere in there is functional competence. So not that someone can be incompetent functionally, but if it's smart, if they have integrity and they operate above board and be open and honest and everything, and they have that drive to succeed, that drive to improve, they're going to be successful in anything, right? Someone can show up on my team and not have any procurement experience. You can learn procurement in a couple months. You know what you can't learn? Integrity. You can't learn how to have that internal motivation to succeed. So if they come with that, those are the things I can't teach. I can teach procurement. Others on my team can teach procurement.
Yeah, it's a great answer because I think no matter what the department, what the role, I think you're right. And it's, something I've learned along the way. It really is all about your ability to identify people who can really do the job and just get, they get the joke, and that it's, just delivering at the end of the day, being someone who's responsible, doesn't fumble the ball and gets the job done. So it sounds like that's the philosophy you have in your group. How is AI changing things? How is technology changing your role and the role of the people that report to you?
So I'd say we're still in the early phases of what AI can do, but it's taking away a lot of the, we'll say, less interesting parts of the job. And so things like we're working on a tool where AI can understand and process order acknowledgements from suppliers. All right. So obviously we have some that are coming through like an EDI or procurement portal. Those are great. But then we have other suppliers who are still sending PDF or email order acknowledgements, either because they weren't big enough or we couldn't get them set up on the portal or not yet. And, if I think of what are some of the worst or dullest portions of a buyer's job, taking an order acknowledgement, reading it, and opening up SAP and updating, all right, yep, the supplier says this is the ship date. That's pretty boring. Yeah. That's not really value add. So having an AI who can do that and do it accurately and then say, all right, yep, this is what we expected, update SAP, nobody has to touch it. Or, oh, no, this isn't what I expected, buyer, this is the one you actually need to look at and do something with. That's a huge help. And trying to expand that same approach, because there's other things that are really not very fulfilling to do. So if you think about like invoice issues, that's probably the least favorite activity of any buyer. If we can get further along in having AI process more invoice or handle some of the simple issues, taking that off the buyer's desks. Now they're doing things that are, I think, more interesting, more value added to the company. And if you take away, hey, we have 10 hours of work that's uninteresting, we can make it 5 hours. You should have a happier, more productive employee.
And I would think, and especially after I watched your comments after, it must have been maybe in the last year, you just referenced it before, the team went through negotiation training or, improving their negotiation skills. And I don't see AI, I think AI helping arm that person with better information and more effective information maybe, but you still need that person to negotiate that contract. What did you learn during that training about yourself and about your team?
So I guess maybe a bit of background on why we tried to undertake that training is the negotiation landscape had changed a bit during COVID. We saw a period of huge high inflation, which changes how you're negotiating with suppliers, right? When you're in a period of pretty low constant inflation and you're in a company that's constantly growing, the discussions you're having are different. It's usually, okay, yeah, maybe costs went up a little, but our volume went way up. So then it's a matter of, well, how much do those small cost increases offset the huge productivity increases of higher volume? That's not the case when inflation's 6, 7, 8, 9%, like we saw for a couple of years. So the conversations are changing, the approach needed to be a little different. So the negotiation consultant we work with, so I'll give a shout out, Eric Riffenberg at Negotiation Experience. Sales side approach, right? Not a procurement side approach. Previous negotiations training I'd done was from the more procurement side, from the buyer side. So his life has been spent mostly on the sales side. So different level of approach, different types of role playing, really getting people thinking differently, using some different tools when they're coming into negotiation. I'd say the thing that I learned most about my team is they had some really wild and creative ideas and approaches when we did some of the role playing on how do we approach this and change our value proposition to the supplier. And so we even, I worked with Eric, we put together a custom role play that involved kind of situations that we were dealing with, but it involved, involved Heraeus, involved, a pseudo supplier or an imaginary supplier in our space. But then you're talking about the medical industry, you're talking about those components and everything. And we did a lot of brainstorming and a lot of collaboration on how do we improve our value to our supplier, right? Because that's one of the other things when we were in the throes of the pandemic and nobody had enough time, labor, volume to get things done, you need to get yourself to the top of the pile. Mm. And some people were able to pay to get to the top of the pile, and some suppliers let you pay, but other suppliers said, no, we're not going to let people just pay enormous expedite fees to get to the top of the pile. And so then it's like, well, how to make ourselves the preferred customer? In some cases, you could say, oh, hey, we're medical, we're helping improve people's lives here. That might be enough in some industries. It's like, do I supply, components to the steel mill or supply it to a med device company? Go to the med device company because it may be more important. But a lot of the suppliers we work with are entirely in medical. So that excuse doesn't work anymore. And so then you start talking about, well, what's our relationship with the supplier? What's our future relationship with the supplier? If we're growing more than other customers, we might be a smaller share of the purchase today, but look 3 years down the road, if we can maintain a great relationship, we're going to be a much bigger customer to them. So they should want to service and want to stay on our good side so they can do business too. Lots of discussions around how to uncover that and then how to communicate that with the supplier so they understand that as well.
So what's next for you guys? What's next for your group? What are you looking forward to? Any new projects around the corner that, it's going to be a big undertaking, but that it's exciting for you?
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier, our company has been quite active in acquisitions. So I'm expecting another acquisition to come around the corner at some point within the next year. Those are always big undertakings in terms of integrating their procurement staff, integrating with spend and the suppliers and everything. But it's also always a fun opportunity because almost always you're acquiring somebody that's an order of magnitude smaller. And you say, hey, here are the suppliers, here are the parts we buy in common. Here's where we have better pricing, better business terms, better relationship. So usually there's a lot of quick gains there. But then I'd say the other piece of maybe a little more internally focused is because we have more attention paid to some of the risk mitigation practices, we're getting support on being able to do more change projects. So whether that's dual sourcing or whether that's material changes to maybe find a material that is either more economically or environmentally sustainable or something with a lower risk. So we're just undertaking more projects overall. I mentioned the project manager skill. This is part of it because we're doing more projects than we've ever done before. And they're not always geared towards just savings. It's geared toward the risk mitigation too. So figuring out, well, how do we balance all these projects? How do we keep stakeholders in the know and communicate, and how do we prioritize them all? It's easy to prioritize projects when they're all around savings. Like what gives you the best ROI? Well, it's a lot harder to quantify a reduction in risk.
That's a great point.
Those are probably our two biggest focuses. the most exciting things coming up in the next year or so.
That sounds great. Well, listen, I kept you a little longer than I promised. I really appreciate you spending time with us, and I look forward to keeping up with you and maybe circling back with you next year.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Kevin. And for all of our listeners and viewers, this is John Pavi, and this has been Smarter Sports Sourcing, and we'll see you again back on our next episode. Thanks.